This talk will include substance use, sexual explicit content, swearing, and reference to sexual assaults. Now I will pass over to Rebecca to introduce our speaker.
Hey everyone, my name is Rebecca and I'm a second year politics and international relations student, and I'm one of the conveners of the LGBT collective here at Holloway, and I'm also the publicity officer of the Amnesty International Society. Our next speaker of the most recent series of events on drug and alcohol awareness is Dr. David Fawcett, a clinical sexologist working in addictions and mental health for the past 3 decades. His talk will discuss the underlying risk factors of substance use, especially focusing on those with heightened risk due to stigmatized identities such as queer people, sex workers, and individuals living with HIV or mental illness. Special attention will be given to combined behaviors such as drugs and sex, a phenomenon in the MSM community known as chemsex, which hijacks the brain's reward circuitry and greatly complicates recovery. Finally, foundational principles of recovery, including components of resilience, will be discussed. Thank you.
Okay, should I just go ahead? That's my cue.
That's it.
Okay, hi everybody. My name's David Fawcett, and really delighted to be part of this conference and coming to you from Florida, where I live in the United States. Let me share my screen. I have a presentation. My work is a little bit different than perhaps your other speakers today. For the past 30 or so years ago, as stated in the introduction, I've been working with people for whom use of drugs and certain behaviors has become problematic. And I think, unfortunately, we live in this kind of dichotomous world where they're either for that model or for harm reduction. I see them as a very seamless blend. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to just kind of share my experience in this context and talk about kind of what I see. So I always start every talk with this lovely picture of water. And it just is a reminder to me and to the observers and everybody to just take a breath and get grounded, because inevitably this material is triggering. And it's triggering for people whose use has become problematic. It can be triggering for others. And that's, I think, really due to the really high levels of dopamine that a lot of these behaviors release, and the really powerful cues and triggers that we see. So anyway, that's just kind of a message to I'll take a deep breath, and I'm going to do the same thing. As a lead-in, I mentioned earlier, a lot of my work has been with people who get in trouble. And if we look at the large spectrum of people who use various drugs, who use various behaviors to alter their perception and their reality sometimes in terms of just an altered space. Even meditation can be defined as that. Most people do it just fine. Some people have some problems, and a very small percentage, and I'm talking, it varies depending on the drug, 5%, 10% people, sometimes 15% of people really start to find they have become problematic. And so that's really what I want to talk about when that happens, what that looks like, what does that mean? And really, what can we do about it? What are some of the causes of it? So with that, I want to just start with a quote from my book, Lust, Men, and Meth, which is directed toward guys that are in trouble with chemsex, but it really pertains. And I would just want to use it to illustrate a point. And by the way, I hate people that read from their slides. This will not happen again, but I wanted to make the point here. Okay, where there is shame or a sense of taboo, it ignites a defiant outburst overflowing with erotic energy and release. The drug, in this case meth, takes a lifetime of feeling different and left out, and by reducing inhibitions, allows one to feel connected in a way that many gay men have never before experienced. At last, they can be a member of the tribe. They finally belong. Membership is expressed sexually by a freedom to share the most intimate secret fantasies and indeed to act some of them out. Ironically, it creates a drug-driven sense of authenticity of, I can finally be me and celebrate my sexuality. My point with this is that these are universal things, right? Everybody feels shame. Everybody gets kind of charged by confronting taboo a little bit. It ignites interest in all of us. Everybody wants erotic energy and release. Everybody probably has had inhibitions and the feeling of being left out and the feeling that they don't belong. So my point is, these are universal aspirations that we all go to. And I think so. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with any of that. The problem is that for some people, as I mentioned, a small minority, it kind of goes off the edge, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I have my hardest slides right up front, all the words, and then this one is my busiest, but it's all downhill from here. But this is a really important slide, and I just want to walk through it. You know, all these addictive impulses resonate in a part of our brain, midbrain, called the limbic system, reward circuitry. It's a whole series of parts of our brain that are connected and distribute dopamine in return for behaviors. And it's an inherent system humans have to keep us going as a species. It rewards certain things like sex. It feels good. We want to do it again. That's good for us as a species. But we can kind of group some of these. And I do this to kind of indicate that not only can drugs affect what we're trying to go for, but so can different behaviors. So if we look at this limbic system, it's a continuum basically with two different endpoints. On the right, we have the arousal, which I call the sort of intensity behaviors. And on the left, we have the satiation. But the arousal, and these, by the way, have very different neurochemical profiles. One, the arousal side is more kind of all the neurochemicals are saying go, go, go. And the satiation side is more of an inhibitory, like stop, slow down. They're more braking mechanisms. So what can we do to get on the arousal side? First of all, we're trying to trigger adrenaline, dopamine, obviously amphetamines, right, of any form, cocaine, meth, diet pills. We always mention things like phentermine, MDMA, which is, of course, has a very different reaction, ecstasy, than meth, but it is an amphetamine. Prescription amphetamines, and in the States we have a huge problem with Ritalin and Vyvanse, and I'm not sure what the brand names are in the UK, but these are prescription amphetamines that are very commonly used and can be quite problematic if they're abused. Behavior-wise, what causes intensity? Gambling, high-risk sex, pornography, excessive, shoplifting, the risk of that. You always hear about people getting caught. It's not about money, it's about the thrill when it gets problematic, obviously. I guess any shoplifting is problematic. Excessive work, gaming, extreme sports. So all these things are a way that we can kind of really trigger ourselves and that's, again, these are normal desires. I think it's, again, the problem for a few people, it goes too far. And by the way, these two things, the arousal side really mimics sympathetic arousal, the fight or flight trauma response, all the adrenaline kind of going for, to kind of keep us prepared and wired. The satiation side mimics the freeze response. Very different neurochemicals, as I mentioned, GABA, endorphins, it slows us down. How do we get there? Different carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates. So if you have your favorite comfort food, ice cream, pasta, baked bread, whatever, alcohol, sedatives, opioids. Also, good stuff, secure relationships, shopping can satisfy this, binge shopping, and binge TV watching. It all releases this sort of comfort level. So I wanted to introduce this because I find with my clients, if they find they have a problem with methamphetamine, and it's just they're using too much, it's really causing problems, they need to stop. Suddenly they may find themselves switching over to other high-risk behaviors excessively, and they just really substituting. So I think that it's important to kind of understand that people can mix and match between the drugs and the behaviors to kind of manipulate their mood and their neurochemistry, and sometimes that can get them in trouble. So when it goes off the edge, what does that look like? And and any sex therapist or any sexologist we're not the morality police. We're not about controlling people's sex. We're not about doing any of that. It's when people self-identify that this is causing me a problem. And there's that can look different for different people. Some people can have a whole lot of some behavior and it's not considered a problem. Other people do a little and it causes them a lot of consequences in their lives. So really this is a highly individualized response and a self-designated response. But what are some of the criteria? And these are criteria right out of the diagnostic manuals, right? Or the ICD or the DSM that we use here. Hazardous use. So, an overdose, getting a dangerous reaction, getting a problem with a physical reaction or some kind of complication of use, an injecting problem or something. So just kind of having real problems with that. Social interpersonal problems, having fights with your lover or partner, having neglect with a lot of chemsex people who've, become addicts, and I try not to use that word, but people who've gone too far, if you will, there can be there's a lack of empathy that can cause and result in a lot of disconnect from that people and a lot of physical violence in certain cases. Neglected major roles, sort of deferring things you need to do socially that you should be doing. Having withdrawal, and that's true, of course, for alcohol, opioids, for amphetamines, and porn and sex, by the way. If there's excessive use, there's no physiological withdrawal per se, but I can guarantee you there is a withdrawal. People get irritable, people get cranky, people get foggy, people get hopeless, people get depressed, people sweat. So yeah, it's very definitely there. Tolerance, a universal thing. It's the beauty of our neuroplastic brains that can constantly adapt as we sort of feed this stuff, whether we're using more and more drugs, more and more of a certain behavior, our bodies adapt. And consequently, though, unfortunately, we need more to get the same effect. And so there's this built-in tolerance. People start to use more, they get more extreme. Sometimes with the fantasies or the acting out gets kind of a little more out there, if you will. And that can cause problems for some people. Using larger amounts, and this is a direct result of that tolerance I just mentioned, repeated attempts to control the use, psychological problems or physical problems related to their use, activities given up, and craving. You get the idea. So any one of these things, now in the United States, for the DSM, if you have 2 of these, it's considered possibly a light problem. And then it goes all the way up to having all 11, where there's a more serious problem. So that's kind of what a therapist like myself would use to diagnose this problem. So it's not just subjective. And in my case, I always really try to collaborate with the client. This is not something I'm saying, hey, you need to do this. It's really coming from them. Okay, so if there is problematic use, and let's just assume there is, let me kind of drill down a little bit into what does that look like and what causes it and what's behind it. So one of the things I think is almost a universal is some kind of experience with trauma. And that, we think of trauma, what a therapist calls trauma with a capital T, that's a major war injury or a natural disaster or a terrible car accident or something like that. But trauma can also be what we call trauma with a lowercase t. Bullying, chronic bullying is one thing. Neglect, and this is one that's we've started to focus on more in the last 10 years or so. And it's a really important one because when we talk about neglect, and when I talk about this with clients, they say, well, I wasn't neglected. We had a roof over our head and food on the table, and we always had great clothes, and I got a car and went to the finest schools, and we took great trips, and how could I be neglected? Well, where the neglect comes in is there's no what we call emotional attunement to that person. Their parents were physically there, they provided the material stuff, but they were totally disconnected. They may not have taken an interest in any hobbies, never come to games, never show any care, always their own work to priority. And so there was an lack of emotional attunement that can result in trauma because from a child's point of view, the caregivers are not available or inconsistently available, which is worse, actually. So trauma underlies a lot of this. What do we do with trauma? We dissociate, we check out, we step off into an altered state. And again, this kind of sets the pattern. If I'm using that desire to drop into an altered state to escape emotional pain, that's the wrong intention from my point of view. And that really comes down to the gist of my whole talk is really what's the intention? Is the intention to kind of disconnect and dissociate and numb things that I don't want to feel? Or is the intention to really have an experience and stay connected and explore and be connected with my inner self and my mind and my spiritual beliefs and anybody I'm with, but it's more of a connected space as opposed to a disconnected space, if you will. And so that disconnected space is very typical of trauma. So shame is a universal, a lot of experience of stigma, and I'm going to talk about that more in a moment. A lot of fear, a lot of feeling less than. In that quote I read at the beginning, talking about belonging, never kind of fitting in. And this last one is something that I've heard my clients say for the last 25 years. These are often guys that are gay and also living with HIV. But this feeling like I feel like damaged goods. That's this core, what I call core belief that really just is emblematic of the shame that's involved with a lot of this. And these are the kind of feelings that people want to numb, as opposed to kind of really amplifying something good that they're feeling. There's a need for intensity. These arousal addictions or behaviors that I talked about are all intensity behaviors that we need more of over time. Typically, it escalates. And there's another characteristic here that for a lot of the intensity, people that are driven to intensity behaviors, is real intolerance of low stimulation. So things like boredom or open space, unplanned time, that really is just kind of it's a low tolerance for that, low frustration tolerance for that. So that's a real issue for recurring use, things like boredom and managing that. So I mentioned stigma, and I want to just talk about this. We know that there's kind of a cumulative effect of stigmatized identities, that anybody might identify with. And there are many. And unfortunately, a lot of the people that I work with that really get in trouble with problematic use have a lot of these different identities. And it's almost as if everyone is kind of weighing down their ability to kind of dig out from concerns. So you can have racial or ethnic minorities that might be a sexual minority. They might have a diagnosis of mental health concern, depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder. They may have an already diagnosed substance use concern. They may have a disability, whether that's an emotional disability or something like HIV or something else that makes them less able to do things in the normal world, normal in air quotes. They may be doing sex work. They may have experienced profound rejection, life-threatening rejection. I work with a lot of gay kids whose parents, still in this era, throw them out, and they get into sex work. They're exploited. They're very vulnerable, and there's a high suicide rate among those kids. So there's still a lot of that going on. Discrimination. And when you have these different identities, you have more and more experiences of discrimination. And so that also profoundly affects stuff. Social isolation, this feeling of disconnect. We have a profound epidemic of loneliness anyway, certainly in the United States. And I imagine it's the same at least in Western Europe. And that's being reflected now in suicide rates. Increasingly in the States, white, Caucasian males in their 40s and 50s, probably the most, entitled group in the country, high suicide rate. Why? Because there's this feeling of loneliness and disconnection. A lot of financial issues, a lot of violence, terrible violence, a lot of suicide, and a lot of inter-community stigma. I'm a gay man living in a very gay place. I live in Wilton Manors. It's I think the gayest town in the country now. We beat Palm Springs by having a now entire city council all gay people, but so it's a little gay town. But even here, there's a lot of inter-community stigma. There's the kind of guys that are really focused on their bodies, don't really want to talk to the twinks, the so-called twinks, and there's all these layers of behaviors that it's really kind of tragic, because I've seen a lot of young gay guys, and not even young, some people just coming out at whatever point in life, come to a place like this thinking, okay, at last I'm home, and then having a terrible time fitting in or finding their place or being rejected. And so I think this stigma really is tremendous. The other thing that's a real factor, and it's related, is what we call adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. And if you don't know about this is a really fascinating thing to know about. This is a longitudinal study that was kind of developed by accident. It started at Kaiser Permanente, which is a huge health management organization, like a payer insurance company in California that has just thousands and thousands of people. And in the 90s, they started in just noticing and documenting and taking care to record different kinds of episodes that children had experienced. And you see the list there. It says abuse, physical, sexual, emotional, intellectual, spiritual, household challenges. So there may be domestic violence. And by the way, we know if you witness domestic violence, or actually witness any kind of violence, you are equally traumatized as if you had been the recipient of that. So a lot of kids watching, fighting in the home is going to was registered as an adverse event that, also, by the way, traumatic event. Substance abuse in the home, mental illness in the home, a parental divorce, an incarcerated parent, a sibling with a chronic illness, anything that made this house sort of a little different. And then neglect, I mentioned that before, the power of neglect, emotional neglect, physical neglect. So they did two basically enrollment periods based on just people that were coming into the clinic in 1995 and 1997, 2 waves in this study, and they basically enrolled over 17,000 people. And so it's a huge, huge database that's gone on right into the present day. And so they have this tremendous database to look and just see what happened. And it's a simple process of correlating, okay, what happened to these kids when they were young and what happened to them as adults. And so they started to have these ability to make some generalizations. So if we have these adverse childhood experiences starting at the bottom of the pyramid and working up, it disrupts our neurodevelopment. We know that trauma, sexual abuse, any kind of neglect, it impairs the ability of the brain to develop normally. Now the brain has the ability to do all these workarounds, so you're not really aware of it. But sometimes if you actually do a scan, you can see differences in white matter and gray matter for kids that have had this disrupted neurodevelopment. So if you have that disrupted neurodevelopment, it translates into different kinds of behavioral problems, lack of emotional connection, lack of vulnerability, lack of trust of other people, all these things that increase in our risk for sexual behavior and intimacy, and that really affects that down the road. So a lot of impairments, a lot of high-risk behaviors, and you get the idea, a lot of death and so on. So it was a profound kind of realization of the impact of some of these. And this is just, so to give you an idea, so 1 out of 8 people, this is the United States, 1 out of 8 people in the United States have 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences. This is what we can see from the study are the risk factors. 3 times the risk of lung disease, 14 times the risk of suicide, 5 times the risk of depression, 11 times the risk of becoming an injection drug user, twice the rate of intercourse, early intercourse before the age of 15, liver disease, and so on. And even worse of all, a shorter lifespan by a lot, if you have 6 or more by 20 years. But it affects other things you can see in the wheel: cardiovascular disease, cancer, your own risk of divorce. So my point is that there's a lot of these issues that can happen that go back right to the family of origin. And we know unless they're addressed, they're going to really create problems down the road and put people at high risk for some of the behaviors we're talking about today. Now, this is not determinative, meaning if you have these, you're not doomed. But what you do need is some intervention to deal with those. So other things I like to look at with people that have whose use has become problematic are these, what I call core beliefs. These are these beliefs that we have about ourselves that are almost like software. They kind of operate in the background. We're not even conscious of them. Many of them are formed when we're very small kids in whatever situation we're in. So if I have caregivers that are not available or inconsistently available, I will make conclusions about things. I will conclude, I can't trust anybody, or I'm on my own, or I'm unimportant, or I'm unlovable, or these things that kind of get embedded as a reaction to what kids are experiencing, and those stay with us. And what I see in my work with therapy with clients is that a lot of these we have to go in and sort of, first of all, unearth these core beliefs that are really kind of crippling people in a way, and change them. We have to really rewrite them, if you will. So some of the ones we often see, I feel like damaged goods. I mentioned that before. I'm basically a bad, unworthy person. And by the way, if a kid is told by a father or a mother or anybody that you're worthless, you're going to be just like your dad or your uncle, or you're just this any kind of negative pronouncement, kids take that in. Kids are not able psychologically to say, whoa, you're full of crap. This is, I'm quite okay, thank you. No, kids don't do that. They believe it. And that goes right in and becomes part of these core beliefs. So somebody probably, if I have a client that says this, he or she was told that. No one would love me as I am. I am unlovable. I need to work hard. I need to have sex with you to show you that I'm lovable. I need to work hard. I need to have a great body, or drive the right car, or have the right job, or have the trophy boyfriend or the trophy wife, or all these externals that we seek validation with that never really quite do the job. My needs are never going to be met if I have to depend on others. This lack of trust. And sex is my most important need. A lot of times with guys that are hypersexual, everything gets translated into a sexual urge. Even if they're depressed, if they're angry, if they're sad, they may not feel sad, they just feel horny. And so it gets kind of translated. So again, I kind of this a repeat of the prior slide, I think. So what are we saying? Multiple stigmatized identities, a lot of stigma and discrimination, a lot of trauma, rejection, and so on. So with that, I want to focus on what we call chemsex, and because it's such a common phenomenon now, especially in the UK and here, increasingly on the continent. And I just want to talk about a little bit about what's different about that, what's worrisome about that, and what we see. So first of all, by the way, just to honor my friend David Stewart, at 5016 Street Clinic, he coined the term chemsex, and his intention with the term chemsex was to refer to the experience of gay and bi men who use chems or drugs in a sexual context, and who also have the shared experience of internalized homophobia and shame and stigma, and this kind of unique experience of gay men. And I'll certainly honor his intention to have that term refer to that experience. But I want to just make the point that this is not a gay thing. This is not just a gay phenomenon where we have this combined sexualized drug use and sexual behavior where they get combined or fused. It can happen with anybody. It can happen with straight men, with straight women, with gay men. With gay men, it just doesn't matter what your gender is, doesn't matter what your orientation is. So just to make that point. So what's going on when these two things fuse? You know, if you remember my arrows at the beginning, we have all these other behaviors that are both substances and behaviors, sexual behavior, among others, gambling, whatever. They're all dopamine based. And dopamine is this neurochemical in our brain that just makes us want to anticipate things. We used to think it was the liking neurotransmitter. And we have a clarification now. It's not so much about liking, it's about anticipating. It's encoding behaviors with this message like, this was really good, let's do this again. And so dopamine is a very strong way to kind of bind things and fuse things. And when we see people consistently using drugs, particularly amphetamines and sexual behavior, and doing that at the same time, eventually in our brain, those become one set of undifferentiated behaviors. And that has ramifications. If that behavior becomes problematic and they start to see me as a therapist, then what our goal is to, all right, probably abstinence from those drugs. So we have to learn how to kind of set the drugs aside, but we can't do that with sex. You know, sex is a part of a normal, healthy life. And so we have to figure out, okay, this sexual behavior was kind of, I lost control over it at one point. How do I bring that back into my life in a healthy way? Healthy, whatever that means, you know, but include sex in your life, not just say, okay, I'm never going to have sex again, as a way of controlling the behavior. So these are the challenges that are often faced. And this is that dopamine that creates this very strong network of triggers and cues. It really heightens desire, that anticipation, the preoccupation I mentioned. It creates that tolerance. They say dopamine has a short shelf life, meaning that if I do something this week and I get that great rush of dopamine, next week my body will have adapted to it a little bit more, and I won't quite get the same rush. I may need to do something more. I may need to have to escalate my behaviors to get that same dopamine. And really it's the dopamine, the high that I'm looking for. And again, at what point is that problematic? You know, that's up to the individual to really look for. So that's the tolerance and this fusion of behaviors. So this is just a chart to give you an idea. I mentioned this reward circuitry is all about surviving as a species, right? So it gives us a little burst of this feel-good dopamine when we do things that help us survive, when we cooperate, when we collaborate, when we have a family unit, when we listen to great music, when we have comfort and relaxation with others, but most of all, when we have an orgasm. When we have an orgasm, that's the most dopamine we can get of any behavior that's not including a substance or another behavior. So just this chart, baseline 1 unit of dopamine just for kind of walking around, living our lives. If we have good food, comfort food that I mentioned, usually about 1.5 times the normal level of dopamine. And then an orgasm is at really twice the normal level. Anything above that is kind of more in excess of what we do normally. So nicotine, by the way, is not on here. Nicotine is more dopamine than orgasm, which may be why nicotine is so hard to give up sometimes. That's like a 2.5 or so. You can see cocaine. And then my point here is methamphetamine, which is just this ridiculous amount of dopamine that it just dumps into the system that becomes really overwhelming for a lot of people. And I know a lot of people who enjoyed different substances and behaviors all their lives. and never had a problem, and encountered methamphetamine, and it really got him. So we have to be just cautious about the drug itself, I think, because it is such a powerful drug. So pardon me for getting into the weeds a little bit here, but this is a really interesting point, I think. So if we look at A here, the dopamine spike, if we are naive to some behavior, so if you think about your very first orgasm, we'd never had that before. When we have such an experience, we have this huge burst of dopamine. You can see that reward at the end of under number 4, it's just boom. And of course, the lesson, the takeaway is, I got to do that again, and fairly soon. And so that's the initial behavior. The same thing happens if I take meth or cocaine. It's a huge reward. I hear a lot of people sort of trying to recapture that first time or the first couple times without much success. So what happens then, though? Our brain is very clever. After that, let's say that orgasm, that was really great. So B, when I start to think about an orgasm, I get a little bit of I get a dopamine burst long before I even had an orgasm. So just the act of thinking about it. And this is where the preoccupation can come in. For people whose use has become problematic, it can take over their lives. They may not be using or acting out, as we might say, except on the weekends, through a long weekend, but the rest of the time, they may be totally preoccupied with it and thinking about it and getting little bits of dopamine, planning what they're going to do on Friday night or anticipating that. The more we train our brains to anticipate that, our brains start to expect that reward. If we're thinking about an orgasm, but we don't get one, we have this situation in C where we actually go into a deficit. Our moods drop, we get kind of cranky and irritable, and that's that withdrawal thing I was talking about before. And then D is that, really we're highly sensitized. We're kind of all over the place. This is where I see, and this is really emblematic, I think, of the problematic users that I see, that small minority of overall users who really have become more addicted to the dopamine rush than anything else. So there's a couple of things here I want to also talk about. There's Robert Sapolsky is a really brilliant neuroscientist. I have a quote over there: maybe greatly increases dopamine released once learned. So that's interesting. If we look at Las Vegas slot machines and the algorithms, which by the way are very similar to the Facebook and social media algorithms, they're all designed to keep you engaged, to keep your eyes on that feed, right? In the case of social media, to sell you something. In the case of gambling, to take your money. But both of them, what they do, they're all programmed to give you occasional hits. And so when we have that's the maybe I'll get it, maybe I won't. That intermittent reward, what this guy Sapolsky said is that makes it almost impossible to break away. There's something about, that's like our kryptonite. We're very susceptible to that if we get involved with that, and just we might get a reward, we might not. Maybe this time, and it just keeps us really engaged. So chemsex per se, just to define it, here's some of the drugs we see: the methamphetamine, of course, GHB, which I'm going to talk about more in a second. Cocaine or crack cocaine, often in the mix. I'm not sure how much that is in the UK. It's very popular again here. And oftentimes people go back and forth between meth and cocaine, depending on pricing in the market. Ketamine, in the States, it's really highly controlled now. Although interestingly, it's been approved for as an alternate for people with major depressive disorder and who are suicidal, who don't respond to any other therapy. In some cases, ketamine reverses that really kind of miraculously. Ecstasy, poppers, amyl nitrate, butyl nitrate, methadone, which you guys have more in the UK than we have here, alcohol, marijuana, other synthetics. There's this wave of what we call novel psychoactive substances that are available all over the internet. They have chemical names, that people kind of tinkering with these chemical formulas and creating their own drugs and sending them out. To me, that's really scary because you don't know what the heck is in those things. And there's a lot of danger in terms of adulterants. I do want to speak about GHB for a minute. GHB, cousin of Rohypnol, the date rape drug. We are seeing, and by the way, I think in chemsex, GHB poses the greatest risk. It's a liquid. It's very easy to overdose. The difference between a nice high and respiratory arrest is not that much, especially if it's taken in a bathhouse or on a dance floor or something where you can really easily do it. But this is really interesting. This was a study from the Terence Higgins Trust in Cambridge. So pretty reputable places they surveyed 5,000 people, about half of whom were gay and had taken G, but they just wanted to document the sexual violence that's going on. And I have seen that myself here. A lot of people are being drugged with G. It's a disabling drug. They're being raped, and then in some cases live streamed, which is really horrendous. And it's pretty damn common, which is really scary to me. I've had several clients here, one of whom I'd seen over a year, who was so ashamed that this happened to him in a bathhouse. He'd been basically drugged and raped, and had such shame about it, he didn't say anything for a long time. So my point is just be alert to it. It's a dangerous drug. The UK is light years ahead of us in terms of, I know 5016th Street, maybe some other places are doing like GHB first aid, because the way to respond to somebody who's overdosed on G is very different than alcohol, for example. And so just really important stuff to know about. So when we combine drugs and sex, what happens? And we're in the final stretch here. So longer periods of preoccupation and sexual intercourse, less discrimination in partners, right? Little use of condoms, increased receptive anal intercourse, which is the highest risk position for things like HIV and Hep C. Interestingly, we're starting to get some research now in the States about heterosexuals using methamphetamine, combining with sex. They're also having increased receptive anal intercourse. So it's not just a gay thing. I think it's an impact of the kind of body high that you get with meth and the comfort levels it can create for perhaps increased sexual desire, that tolerance I mentioned, and that high recurrence of this fusion of drugs and sex. So in the interest of not everybody's an addict, I love this study. It's from NYU. They had the brilliant idea of, okay, all the drug research basically is on people who self-identify as addicts who are seeking help. And it's kind of a skewed data sample. So they decided to go to survey guys who are going to a private gym in New York City. So, and the one they picked is a very expensive one, like hundreds of dollars a month to be able to meet. So these are people of means, gay men who thought of their bodies. They're in a gym taking care of their health. So what drugs were they using? So here we go. PD5 inhibitors are things like Viagra, the erectile dysfunction drugs, inhalants, your poppers, cocaine and meth. And so, yeah, a lot of the behavior. It's not just people who are self-identified problematic users. These are really your average kind of gay guy in Chelsea and in the street. So it was just interesting to me. So a big accelerant, I think, and I'm sorry if these are triggering, I thought of that later, the social media piece. We had two factors. This meth epidemic in the States lasted far longer than it normally does. It began really and got in full force around 2000. And normally they kind of burn out and come back in waves. It didn't happen. And I think it's two reasons. One, around 2005-06, we outlawed in the States pseudoephedrine, which is the main building block of creating meth. If you're a home, what we call mom and pop meth cooker, you need a lot of pseudoephedrine. And they made it only possible to buy one box, and you had to go to the pharmacy counter and give your driver's license, and they recorded you in a database. And so suddenly it just wiped out the supply of meth. The demand was still there, and in stepped the friendly Mexican drug cartels, who actually streamlined an earlier protocol to make meth. They built these meth factories on the border from Texas to California, and they're just churning this industrial strength, high grade, high purity, low cost meth into the state. So that really gave the epidemic a new life. And then around 2010, 2012, so we started to get smartphones. And with smartphones, we started to get apps. And I think apps have also been a tremendous feature in not only enabling people to connect, but also fueling people if they have some problematic use. So just to really be aware, and I don't know where we go with social media. For people that have really struggled with it, I have a lot of young gay guys who, and not so actually gay guys of any age, frankly, who rely on those apps to connect with other people. And so I kind of jokingly talk, I'm old school, let's do a course on old-fashioned cruising behavior, with winks or the hanky codes or whatever. Let's go back and just do face-to-face. Might be a nicer way to do it. So just finishing up here, tolerance. I mentioned before, that's that where we had the high, the first drug, and then it fades out pretty quickly. And this is where the escalation comes in. And this is frankly, I think the key to a lot of people getting into problematic use. They get into using because they're seeking this high that they have a lot of trouble with. So recovery, especially from chemsex, kind of up and down, relapse is part of it, or recurrence is part of it. So my 2 cents on, several decades of working with this, social connection, that is the key. People have to be connected socially. If you haven't seen Johan Hari's TED Talk on addiction, please check it out. It's called Everything You Know About Addiction is Wrong. And his tagline basically is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, the opposite of addiction is connection. And I so endorse that. The idea of belonging, belonging, and critically important, retention. So the best implication for success that I can have as a mental health provider is to keep people coming back, keep people engaged. That means not judging, that means not shaming, that means really helping and connecting, often with people as a human being, right? That's my style as a therapist, but to really, okay, let's collaborate on this, because there's so many therapists that do such harm with a lot of judgment. We can't do it by ourselves. I think 12-step programs are important. They're not the only part. There's smart recovery. There's other kinds of programs. Refuge and Dharma recovery, depending on which coast you're on in the United States, is a more Buddhist-based recovery program. So there's a lot of alternatives. And 12-step is not the only way. It's very dominant in the United States. But I think to look at that for people, again, who need help cutting back on their behavior, it's a long-term process. This is not a quick overnight thing, and we really need a lot of groups and support. Just to give you a peek behind the curtains, from a therapeutic point of view, with somebody who's got a really bad problem, a lot of problematic use with chemsex, what do we see? I see what we call decreased verbal memory. This is a direct result of the drugs, amphetamines in general, but meth particularly. Decreased verbal memory means that our frontal cortex isn't working as strongly as it normally would, and we have a lot of hard time putting together words. Reading, I've had clients say they couldn't read. It felt like these were without ADHD, but feeling like they did have ADHD from the use of the meth. So a lot of abstract thinking. For me as the therapist, I have then translated the standard. One of the standard tools therapists use is cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy requires some kind of mental agility that I think a lot of times early on, the chemsex users I see don't have. And so we watch that. Increased visual memory, it's the opposite of the verbal, but increased visual memory is high. Visual memory means I am highly susceptible to everything in my visual universe. And we have a lot of studies about attentional bias and all this kind of interesting stuff, that when we have these high intensity stimuli, as we get with sex or porn or meth, we really train our brains to notice stuff that might lead us back to that. And these triggers really kind of persist in the brain for a while. I've had clients who were 8 or 9 months totally not using drugs by plan, and they'd get a text from somebody on their phone out of the blue, using buddy, and instantly they would be preoccupied again. So these are really, really strong, and people are highly sensitive to visual stimulation. Prolonged cognitive impairment. Methamphetamine is unique that it really injures the reward circuitry. That's the neural pathways in our brain that keep dopamine flowing as it should. Meth is actually neurotoxic to those dopamine receptors. The good news is that it comes back. They grow back, they regenerate. The bad news, it takes up to 2 years for a really serious meth user to get that back. But in the meantime, what we see is high impulsivity, a lot of hopelessness, and other kinds of things. There again, prolonged impulsivity, and that damaged reward circuitry at the bottom. That's what I was talking about. With meth, really is neurotoxic to these dopamine receptors. And when we don't have good dopamine, we get very depressed. A lot of users in recovery, when they give it up, have something called anhedonia, which means an inability to experience pleasure. They have reset their baseline level of stimulation so high by using these amphetamines or pornography or even sexual acting out, which are all really high intensity, high stimulating activities. They've reset the baseline so high that you have to reach that level to find interest in anything. So they may have a problem having sex with their partner or their husband or their wife. They may, their favorite food maybe doesn't taste as good. Their favorite opera is just kind of annoying to listen to. Nothing seems very good. So there's a lot of impulsivity as well. The prefrontal cortex is offline. Very simply put, where addiction lives in this reward circuitry, it's like all go, go, go. And kind of the adult in the room is our prefrontal cortex that it says, whoa, let's put on the brakes. That's not such a good idea. And that really, with these problematic users, that kind of goes offline. I think, yeah. So once people get in trouble, I want to leave some time for questions. So this is from my point of view, when somebody seeks help, oftentimes they haven't had a physical workup in a while. They've been off their HIV meds, which is the HAART, the highly active antiretroviral therapy. They may have had complications. I've had a lot of older, and by older, they're younger than me, guys in their 50s who have used a lot of meth and have really caused some cardiac damage. And if you remember that beginning slide where it's arousal, these are all fight or flight. It's like putting your gas pedal to the floor and keeping it there, and your motor just revs and revs and revs. Our hearts are not designed to do that. And as we get older, it puts more stress on them. So people have strokes, people have heart attacks, people have pulmonary hypertension, and a lot of paranoia with meth especially. This is really one of the main indicators if your use has gotten bad, or this is persistent paranoia. And really it's a hallmark of meth and can be really problematic. So to sum it all up, if you're getting recovery, if that's a choice you make, I think it almost has to be abstinence-based. Once you cross the line, especially with meth, I don't see that you can go back. It's a long process. It is relapse prone or recurrence prone. You have to really address the triggers and cravings, manage those moods, give yourself time, and really learn how to reincorporate sex and intimacy without getting triggered to use drugs at the same time. Okay, last slide, shameless self-promotion. I did a documentary. I was an executive producer. I'm really proud of this, called Crystal City. It's on Amazon Prime. It follows, it's focused at recovery, abstinence-based recovery, 12-step. So it's very focused. It's not meant to be a whole survey. So it doesn't address harm reduction too much, but it covers about 8 or 9 guys in recovery from crystal meth in New York City. My book, Less Men and Meth. And I have a podcast there you can see. And I helped set up a chemsex treatment program, one of the few in the United States, at Seeking Integrity. We're in Los Angeles. So that is that. Let me stop sharing and we'll go to any questions.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, David. That was an amazing talk. That was, yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent.
And we have a round of applause.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to unmute their mic.
Thank you.
And we will have Crystal City on DNA's to watch list.
Oh, cool. Okay. By the way, it can be triggering for people. There's some explicit shots in there, just so you know.
Thank you very much. So anyway, please feel free to put your questions in the comments. But to begin, though, I wanted to ask, you talked about prolonged cognitive impairment when it came to meth. And I was wondering how much of it, I mean, it depends on the case, obviously, but how much permanent, as in lifelong damage, will there be for someone, even someone who eventually becomes sober?
Yeah, so I think the good news is that we don't see a lot of that permanent impairment, simply because the brain does kind of regenerate that reward circuitry, the neural connections between the prefrontal cortex and that midbrain where addiction lives, if you will, those start to come back. So the brain starts to function better. And so that impairment is not as strong. Now, if you have, I've seen people, let me jump back. The paranoia is my big concern with this because it's really severe sometimes. And I've had clients who, 3 and 4 months into therapy and sobriety would still check out my air conditioning vents for, cameras and microphones. And it was really serious. They're really bothered by it. And most of the time that clears up within a month or two. There are some people, though, that have pre-existing thought disorder issues, or maybe pre-existing depression or anxiety. And in those cases, sometimes that can persist, which is scary. It's like, it's a little bit of a gamble. You don't know how it's going to turn out. Fortunately, those kind of symptoms respond well to an antipsychotic medication, which is kind of a scary thing to have to take, but it's a low grade. They have a certain dose for schizophrenia, bipolar, and for some folks with meth issues, it's a much lower dose, but it does seem to help.
Brilliant. Well, we have a question from the committee. If dopamine fuses behaviors, how does the individual or therapist work to separate those behaviors when they enter into the area of addiction or problematic use? I.e., how do you separate sex addiction and drug addiction?
Right. Wow. And how much time do we have? Okay.
Well, as long as you want to go for it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's a really difficult one. It's certainly the kind of the work I've been doing for the last 2 decades, honestly, because really once those become, there's very little in the literature. There's an interesting case. It was a guitarist, I think a classical guitarist, who had some accident, and his second and third finger became undifferentiated. So when his brain sent an impulse to one finger, they both moved. And so there's an extensive physical therapy to retrain his brain, literally, to separate those. Doing that with sex is much harder. And so my strategy for doing that is, first of all, to really limit the amount of high intensity addiction related fantasies, if you will. So again, we want to figure out how can we bring sex back in without triggering the need for the substances if they become fused. And so one of the ways is to really start to find other ways that people might find erotic arousal. And as I mentioned, because the stimulation is so high with those behaviors, nothing really seems to compete. So a lot of the therapeutic process initially is grieving. I have to tell my clients, okay, you have to let that go, because sex without those chemicals is not going to be the same. It's just going to be different. And not better or worse, it's apples and oranges. And I'm a sex therapist, and I talk about the beauty and intensity of really having a sexual experience with someone where you're really connected with them emotionally. And so it's a whole different kind of thing, but it takes time to get that. A couple tips, just quickly. I found we know now from brain scans that if we even think about those fantasies in our arousal template, and I could talk all day about arousal templates, but it's a map of arousal that we have in our head of what we find sexually appealing, and that gets really kind of hijacked by this because of tolerance, sort of normal stuff. I've had clients say, and this kind of lays it out, a client say in the beginning, so you're dooming me to a life of vanilla, boring, or no sex, right? And no, that's not it. You can be as kinky as you want, but we ought to be really careful about if that kinky behavior has fused with that drug behavior. We got to really be careful about that. So explore other things and really try to find other ways that are doing. One thing I've really recommend is really, when we get into these addictive, ends of the spectrum, it's all about that fantasy, the intensity of dropping into the fantasy. And what I found successfully working with clients is that, okay, we can't really ever compete with that chemsex fantasy. There's just too much dopamine involved. It's not sustainable. So I don't want to try to match another fantasy. It's not going to work. What I really encourage people to do is drop into their body and really start to think about, I do a lot of somatic work, both in my trauma therapy and also with this. And okay, let's connect with your body. Where are you feeling what? What is your body telling you? And there's a wonderful exercise by Masters and Johnson, sex therapists, now 50 years ago in the United States, called sensate focus. It's SENSATE focus, meaning kind of focusing on the senses. It's all over Dr. Google, but you can see it's a physical communication exercise that starts out non-sexual. And so you need a partner, but you're a pleasurer and a receiver. And it starts to work with your body. And in my experience, our bodies are also wired for arousal. And so instead of competing with that head fantasy trip, really let your body start to work with it. So I try to get people to attach to that erotic arousal in different ways. I think the challenge is it's still there. It's just trying to connect to it. And also, of course, a lot of times people who become, I think, addicted are self-medicating for inhibition or body shame or trauma in the past or whatever. So also dealing with those issues before people can really be comfortable, being in an intimate situation with somebody. Because oftentimes the drugs were used to kind of numb those barriers and allow them to act out or behave or get involved. But then if you don't have the drugs, it's very difficult for them to do that. So it's a lot of issues at once dealing with, but it's a really critical path. The other thing I think I started to say, if we think about it, it keeps it alive. And this is really a new phenomenon. So I don't have to go and use methamphetamine to get that dopamine burst. I just have to start thinking about it. And then I start to get that kind of dopamine drip. And then I get preoccupied and it gets really tricky. So.
Wait, so could you I don't know, fake the hit, if you were to say, if you were just to think about meth? Like,
Your brain starts to anticipate what's coming, right? If you start to think about it. And so I've had clients who were trying to reintegrate sex back in without being triggered to use drugs. And it was very slow, the process. And when we talked about what they were doing, they were so frustrated because early on, they had trouble getting an erection, they had trouble having an orgasm. The only way they could kind of get over the top and have an orgasm was to very briefly think about one of those meth fantasies, even though they hadn't used any drug. And we know from brain scans and just experience, when we do that, it kind of keeps the whole thing alive. And so we really have to kind of let those fantasies go dormant. What we know unfortunately about arousal templates, this is a whole other talk, but once those elements are in our arousal template, they're there. We can't just get rid of them. And so if I have been a meth user and really escalated to the point where and I've had guys, finding, into satanic stuff and all these really kind of extreme fantasy situations just to get the dopamine, those will always be there. And sometimes they're unwanted and disturbing to the person once they move into a healthier place. And so they have to really be careful about reigniting those. The best we can do is just kind of let them go dormant.
And also, because I noticed this is a later question, is that the same thing as reward prediction error?
I was going to say it links. I think what you're talking about kind of intrinsically links with my other question, which was about reward prediction error. And I think you've pretty much answered it already. But I'm really interested in reward prediction error and its role in addiction, both in kind of causing addiction behaviors and perpetuating them.
Right. And I think when we get into these behaviors and substances that have such a huge reward in terms of the dopamine release, they kind of hijack everything else. And I think they train our brain to really be very sensitive to them. And I think that is what's really hard for people because because of dopamine, and there's so much dopamine flowing around in the system, everything gets connected to it. So the street where my dealer lives, the motel where I met somebody, the house where I used once, the place where I first got injected. Yeah, all these are kind of also cues and triggers. Processes, the end of the workday, 4 o'clock comes. I usually party after work. And so suddenly I'm like starting to think about it automatically, or Friday nights or weekends, or if you use drugs or behaviors to kind of numb uncomfortable feelings after I have a fight with my boyfriend or after I pay my bills, if I'm short, anything, we can sort of self-medicate. But it all predicts that, and it can be a problem.
And it can be a problem even on like the smallest scale. I know personally, like I'll finish work and I have that assumption that I'm going to have a drink, and I have this reward prediction occur in my brain, exactly. and then I decide not to because it's not a good idea for me sometimes, and then my mood is dropped, and that causes more kind of behaviors. And I think it's an interesting way of thinking about it and analyzing and understanding the mind. So thank you for that. It was really useful.
Yeah. And there's on the arousal template thing, there's a really brilliant little video. It's like 3 or 4 minutes by a woman in the UK, a sex therapist called Paula Hall. And I'll have to provide the link with you guys later, but it really explains in a really kind of brilliant format how this works with dopamine. And once we associate it with behaviors, she talks about using the map of Britain as an example. London is your everyday kind of ho-hum existence, but Brighton is where you go and have fun. And so that's our escape behaviors. And the first time we go to Brighton, it's going to be like on the back roads, the B roads, and have trouble getting there. But the more we do it, the more kind of that becomes a super highway, and we can get there effortlessly. And so we're training our brain to kind of go there automatically. And that's the really hard part in recovery if people choose to give it up, because our brains automatically know how to do this. Like a horse, finding its way back to the barn, it doesn't need to be told where to go. Our brains know that. Yeah.
Right. We have a couple of questions from Junior Maxwell. It's asked that you host a week every Tuesday on In the Rooms, and he was wondering if this is open to people in the UK as well as the US. And he also asks, could you explain the 18-month rule regarding brain rewiring and the abstaining from sex as well as meth?
Yeah, so I do a free chemsex support group, it's called, at a platform called In the Rooms. In the Rooms is it's a free platform for all kinds of addiction-related kind of recovery meetings. You have to create a login profile, but it's free. My meeting is specifically not any kind of 12-step fellowship or anything. There's crosstalk, I get feedback, I do some teaching, but basically we're trying to create a space where people feel safe to talk about this, because there's no easy room. There's rooms that you can talk about your sexual behavior, there's rooms where you can talk about your drug behavior, but kind of nobody wants to talk about all of it combined. Now the problem for folks in the UK is that it's at 8 p.m. Eastern, which I think is 1 o'clock.
Yeah,
it's a really tough. I get a lot of guys from Australia, interesting because it's morning. So the timing is really tough. On the other thing, the research that we have about the reward circuitry is from we're very fortunate, the head of our National Institute on Drug Abuse is Dr. Nora Volkow, whose research specialty is methamphetamine. So she's done a lot of work on the damage meth does to the dopamine receptors and the length of time it takes to kind of regenerate them back to baseline. And she came up with the age of 24 months based on her scans. Now, just on the ground experience with my clients, I've had clients kind of have some of the symptoms of that, with the impulsivity and the kind of hopelessness and the brain fog and that kind of stuff. But in every case, it's cleared up by 12 months. So I think, yeah, maybe their brain is doing some kind of fine tuning, but basically the person doesn't feel it. Now, there's a magic number here that doesn't exist. So people, and this question comes up all the time. Okay, so I decide that I have a problem with compulsive sexuality. It's getting in my way. A lot of sex therapists recommend, okay, take a timeout, right? And there's been a lot of confusion, and there's been no research on this. There's nothing in the literature, but just a lot of experience. So a lot of guys say 90 days works, and this is 90 days, not masturbating, not having sex, just to kind of let your brain cool off. Some people say a month, some people say longer. I found it's really highly individualized. I've had clients who could go back right away and even look at pornography and not get triggered. Other guys couldn't even think about sex, and they were grateful not to think about it for 90 days while they kind of addressed other behaviors and things in their lives. I would never say 18 months to anybody. I think that's way too long. If I have a client really by 3 or 4 months, if they're not having some kind of reactivation of sexual urges, then I think we really start to work on that, because that's a problem. And I've had clients, who would go 12 months or 18 months with no return of sexual urges, and that's a real problem. And those cases, that's where we drill down. What are you doing? And that they're thinking about meth, they're looking at meth porn, but not using the drug, that kind of stuff. And there's very specific genres of porn, as you know, and you can find those rooms. So, yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. And we've got a question from Kristen Mathias. What activities / report might work effectively in order to help someone who is in a middle or deep level of drug addiction, potentially meth?
So I think that idea of connection is really critical and that at every level. If you're lucky enough to have an intimate partner, that's one thing, but a circle of friends, acquaintances, recovery people, and the broader circle. I mean, just in my mind, every connection with another human being is how we get that energy for recovery. It's just, we can't do it by ourselves. We can't imagine it or think about it. So I think that connection is really critical. The other thing is looking at the rewards center and dopamine. Okay, how else can we get dopamine? What else is going to give my life pleasure? And there's certainly sex, and sex is sometimes a struggle, as I indicated, but there's other things. What about food? What about great music? What about your dog? I jokingly, my maximum dopamine output during this pandemic was, at home, with my partner and my dog on the couch watching Netflix. That was fabulous. But so that worked for me. But I think exercise, by the way, wonderfully important. So exercise is great just for our moods in general, for emotional kind of regulation. But it's also particularly good in this case because exercise produces different amino acids that are actually the building blocks, the specific building blocks of that reward circuitry that we're regenerating. And so that can actually theoretically help speed up that recovery of that. So connection, activity, physical exercise, and the other thing I would say is mindfulness. And a lot of times the people I work with are serious amphetamine users. They have a hard time, as I mentioned, with boredom or with sitting still or with not being busy all the time. And so learning how to tolerate even 5 minutes of kind of quiet time is critically important. But we're getting more and more research on mindfulness and the positive impact it has on our brains, both kind of morphologically and also psychologically. So and plus it's just an awareness exercise. I think by the time these folks get to me, if they're addicted, they've really kind of lost touch with their bodies. They've lost touch with kind of what's going on with other senses. And so mindfulness is just kind of a way of regrounding someone and getting them really balanced and back in the game. So I think that's the other thing I'd really strongly recommend.
That's brilliant. We've got one last question from Ben C. Says, thanks for including adverse childhood events, ACEs. Pardon me, that wasn't actually a question. People are now broadening ACEs to look at structural racism and sexism and as adverse childhood events. Can you talk a bit on that?
Yeah, sure. And I think that goes right in with the kind of slides I had on stigmatized identities and just all these different backgrounds and experiences that people have. And I think, right now in the States, we're going through an especially I think painful time that we're really all the structural racism that is embedded in our whole culture is really kind of being revealed. So I think, yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe more than ever, I've been thinking, and I haven't seen any research on this, it's probably too soon, but with the advent of phones and videos and just everything so visual and graphic, not only is it exposing this, which is an important piece, but I think it's also kind of traumatizing a lot of people in a low-grade way. I mean, I think it's important, but I think it's really exposing what's happening. But I think it's not easy to watch those videos. I mean, I can't watch them anymore, but they're important for sure. And thank you, Ben. I love your work.
Well, thank you very much. That was an amazing talk. I think, yeah, and if we all learned an incredible amount from that.
I do have one final question for David Linus.
Go ahead.
David, you mentioned kind of in the beginning of your talk the importance of intentionality when using mind-altering substances and how problematic use often comes from a kind of confused intentionality or maybe a lack of understanding. Do you have any recommendations like practices or techniques to help clarify intentions when someone does decide to use a substance?
Yeah, and that's kind of an abstract area. But I think to bring up mindfulness again, I think just really examining that. When we're in the pull of that dopamine kind of fueled preoccupation, it feels very different. It feels like I got to have this now. It's a very, I think just developing an awareness of that space versus the other. And so I think just kind of stopping and examining, what's the goal? Is the goal to numb, to not feel, to check out? And a healthy goal, I think, can be, okay, I want to really, I have a pretty heavy meditation practice, that I'm going into an altered space, so I think, but by intention and clear-minded. So it's just, I think, just that self-awareness piece, and whatever practice is useful for that. Mindfulness is a great one, I think. But I think also learning how it feels if you're driven with that preoccupation of that pull to get dopamine. That's to me a very dangerous space. And a lot of times people aren't even aware it's happening until they see a physical trigger or an emotional trigger, but I think you can, with a little awareness, you can start to know when that, you can know how that feels. And I think to really cut it off, the earlier you can cut that off, the more success I think you have. There's my colleague, Dr. Rob Weiss, has a great image of, a boulder on the mountain. And if you starting to roll over, if you stop it right before it goes off the edge, you have a greater chance of keeping it from going over. But if it's halfway down gaining steam, it's going to be really hard. That's the role of the apps. I think once people are on these apps like Grindr, Tinder, Scruff, and you're getting dopamine flow, and it's a tricky situation for people that have had trouble with it.
Awesome. Thank you. That was great.
Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. I really enjoyed that. And yeah, amazing. Thank you everyone for coming as well. Great questions, great discussion.